Okay, welcome everyone joining us around Australia and around the world to this public panel on the topic Coronavirus and the Left, hosted by the Melbourne chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. My name is Ryan Mickler and I'll be the moderator for this event. This is the second Platypus panel ever hosted in Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we thank the audience for being in attendance. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s to 1930s, the new left of the 1960s to 70s, and the post-political left of the 1980s to 1990s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities on Facebook, Instagram at Platypus Melbourne, or by visiting our website, www.platypus1917.org, or through our podcast titled Shit Platypus Says, which can be streamed on SoundCloud. Platypus Melbourne also runs a reading group where we go through a yearly syllabus from Rousseau to Marx to Lenin to Adorno, trying to understand what Marxism was. There are two streams of this reading group running concurrently. One stream meets in person on Mondays in Carlton and the other on Wednesday nights on Zoom for Australia-wide participation. The panel description for today is Coronavirus and the Left, and the following prompt was provided to all panelists. In the midst of the crisis of neoliberalism in the 21st century, the coronavirus has created a historically unprecedented situation. Never before has a virus been the object of political conflict to this extent. The current health crisis, which was instigated by the appearance of the novel virus, and the accumulating political crisis of the previous decades seem to be inextricably intertwined, making it impossible to separate the scientific from the political aspect. Only very rarely have we experienced such an extensive and sustained restrictions on our individual rights due to a pandemic or natural catastrophe like the one that is upon us now. The current circumstance has led to new divisions within the left. On the one hand, we noticed a neo-social democratic attitude, which basically approaches the state from a progressive standpoint. On the other hand, there is a neo-anarchist perspective, which views the state's pandemic policies with skepticism. Simultaneously, we wonder whether the pandemic reveals or obscures the creeping transformations of capitalism and whether capitalism as we knew it is still with us. Given this, Platypus asks 4 questions. 1, to what extent is the coronavirus a natural disaster, and to what extent is it a socially shaped or mediated phenomenon? 2, to what extent are the political consequences of the coronavirus crisis part of a deeper transformation towards a, quote, post-neoliberalism? 3, what relationship exists between these neo-positions of social democracy, neo-anarchism, and neoliberalism, and their historical predecessors in the 19th and 20th century? 4, how should a political left react towards the growth of state power over civil society that resulted from the handling of the pandemic? That's the prompts that the panelists have been asked to respond to. Our format is simple. Each of the 4 speakers will have around 12 minutes for opening remarks, then 6 minutes each after, where everyone has a chance to respond to the fellow panelists before an hour or so of audience Q&A. And our speakers for today are, read out in an agreed upon speaking order, Tommy Lawson is a member of Geelong Anarchist Communists, formerly of Resistance, the Socialist Alliance and Democratic Socialist Perspective. After breaking with the Trotskyist tradition for anarcho-syndicalism, he later aligned with the platformist specificist tendency of anarchism and is today influenced by council communism and left communism. He is a rank and file member of the Electrical Trades Union and recently published an article at redblacknotes.com titled Understanding the Right-Wing Attack on the CFMEU. Ian Rintoul is a founding member of the Trotskyist organization Solidarity and formerly a member of the International Socialist Organization. He is a refugee rights advocate and spokesperson for the Refugee Action Coalition Sydney. Ian recently published an article with James Supple on Solidarity's website entitled Don't Scab, Get the Jab, a slogan no unionist should use. Simon Copland is a PhD scholar at the School of Sociology at the ANU. He is studying the online manosphere with expertise in far-right extremism, misogyny, and hate online. He studies anti-politics using Marxist critiques of the state to analyze a growing distrust in political systems. Simon is also the president of the ANU branch of the NTU and recently published an article in The Atlantic magazine called How the Smug Politics of COVID-19 Empowers the Right. I hope to only call on questions during the Q&A after both the speakers have had their first two sections. If you in the audience have more of a comment, then I encourage you to work into a short piece of writing and submit it to our international open submission journal, the Platypus Review, where the transcript from this event will be published along with selected responses. The event will conclude in under 3 hours, just before 9:30 p.m. And with that, I hand it over to Tommy, who will begin his opening remarks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. All right. So first thing I want to do is acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nations. Sovereignty was never ceded. Okay. We've been asked to discuss the crisis that is COVID and the response of the left. It's undoubtedly ironic that a pathogen has exacerbated the contradictions of capitalism in a way that the antagonism of the worker and capitalist has not done for decades. The first thing we should note is that the global spread of the virus and the devastation it has wrought upon the world community was not inevitable. Coronavirus was, at least partially, created by the increasingly centralized, monocultural and expansive system of capitalist agriculture, where capital forces human life to expand deeper into the increasingly restricted natural habitats. It brings humans and livestock into closer contact with previously undiscovered and untouched viruses. From there, the jump from wild animal to livestock to human is unavoidable. It is likely that the recurrence of pandemics is only going to increase. In terms of the national response to the virus, we've seen many varied approaches, from the first Italian lockdowns to the half-hearted that turned into let-it-rip efforts in the US and the UK. Nearly 5 million people across the world have died as we still struggle to contain the virus. Where lockdowns have either failed or abandoned, the only thing that we've had in response is the vaccine. However, the global distribution has followed lines typical of the world's imperialist pecking order. Poorer nations are generally left without vaccines, while the rich, somewhat return to normal. So what about the response in Australia? We've faced some of the longest lockdowns in the world. Melbourne recently surpassed Buenos Aires as the most locked down city internationally. During the initial state-by-state lockdowns, government intervention into the economy and spending in the form of support payments was heralded by some as a sign we may be moving beyond neoliberalism. This wishful thinking on the part of reformist socialist left thought we might see a shift towards some kind of neo-Keynesian economics. But the catch is this: Keynesianism was a response by sectors of the ruling class in its state to contain the threat of working class revolution. The Soviet Union was relatively new. Europe experienced a wave of workers' revolts. Strike waves racked America, and the Spanish Revolution was at the doorstep. There's no corresponding examples of such significant proletarian power today. Neoliberalism seems to be safe beyond its own contradictions. Global states seem to have by and large contained them for now. That being said, new openings may still appear. Today's capitalist states could not wait to reopen the economy after COVID to unleash it upon the population. That they took so long only really reflects the realization that you need living labor to keep capital accumulating. Now that the imperialist nations are largely vaccinated, we're entering a return to normal. That normal, however, revolves around an increasingly strained and sometimes collapsing healthcare system, facing the number of COVID cases in ICU. The other side of it is the increased police powers. I'm pretty sure that everyone on the left in Australia is going to be incredibly worried by the new toys that the Victorian police unleashed on the anti-vax protesters recently. So, the left must obviously find answers to the new challenges that we are posed and dealing with in today's COVID-born contradictions. One response has been what I would call, as much as I hate to abandon the word, knee-jerk libertarianism. By this, I mean immediate opposition to anything the state has done to curtail the COVID crisis. I'm not sure that this could be correctly classified as neo-anarchist in any meaningful way. Anarchism's concern with the rights and the individual are collectively constructed and mediated, which is not necessarily the understanding of other perspectives. The thing that Ryan read out before about Ian actually made me realize with his article, Don't Scab, Get the Jab, about this sort of oppositional understanding of collective rights, because I was actually one of the people that helped coin that. So I think that's quite amusing, because I guess for us, the right to to not be vaccinated can kind of be counterposed with the right to not get someone else sick. So yeah, I think that's an interesting tangent that we might go down during the discussion. At any rate, in general, sectors of the left have opposed lockdowns and the vaccine mandates in their entirety, while others have taken nuanced lines, the positive and negative aspects. While some demand that we return to normal, others point out life as anything but normal for healthcare workers or to the families of the 9 people who died of COVID in Victoria today. So, to address the neo-anarchist question, Lenin once said that anarchism is punishment for the sins of social democracy's opportunism. It's an amusing statement, and perhaps it's true, but the punishment is only for those whose vision of a free society is limited by social democratic practice. For Rudolf Rocker, to anarchists, the point of attack in the political struggle lies not in legislative bodies, but in the people. Political rights do not originate in Parliament. They are, rather, forced on Parliament from without. Perhaps then, anarchism is the embodiment of the lessons learned from the degeneration of the early parliamentary socialist left. If today we can speak of a neo-social democracy in the form of Corbyn, Sanders, and projects like the DSA all the way through to Victorian socialists, then we can speak of the neo-anarchism as those who are once again learning from the dead end of parliamentary socialism. Electoral means have been rediscovered in various forms. It's being argued once again that they're a solid basis to agitate, engage the masses, and shift society to the left. Perhaps there are some out there that maintain the delusion that conquest of political power by workers can be achieved by such means. The thing is, all these efforts have been rather dismal failures. Huge swathes of the global population have zero faith in institutional representative bourgeois politics. However, this does not necessarily mean that this is a progressive tendency. Rather, I would suggest that this is not the avenue that we should be going down as revolutionaries. Some might argue that the last few decades have constituted a neo-anarchist tendency in the social struggle of movements like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, etc. While there's truth that these movements have features that are linked to anarchism, direct democracy, direct action, independence from electoral parties, etc., they cannot be said to be really anarchist in any way, certainly no more than they can be said to be socialist. As Mark Bray pointed out, this horizontalism lacks the key component of anarchism: political content and vision. Anarchism emerged as the federalist wing of the revolutionary socialist movement. Beyond its core values, it has a foundational set of strategies, it has vision, and it has content. These are not necessarily defining features of social movements. Social movements belong to the oppressed classes in general. What they can, however, constitute is the shifting of consciousness and the construction of what we might call popular or workers' power. This power, developed and demonstrated by the masses taking direct action, is a demonstration of the capabilities dormant in the broad working classes. I'll quote from Bakunin now. He says, "It is true that there is in the people a great elementary force, a force beyond that of the government and that of the ruling classes as a whole. But without organization, the elementary force is not a real force. It is this undeniable advantage of organized force over the elemental force of the people that the state is based. Therefore, the problem is not so much to know if the people can revolt, but they are capable of building such forms of organization that give them the means to reach successful ends. Therefore, to speak of neo-anarchism, much as we speak of classical anarchism, it means we seek to give direction to such elemental force. The direct action of social movements undoubtedly teaches people that power, they can act for themselves in pursuit of their goals, but it misses the fundamental problem of capitalist society. That is, social movements in general do not necessarily educate workers that the wage-labor relationship is at the heart of capitalism. Thus, the elementary force of the workers must be harnessed, organized, and given political content, but not in the sense of parliamentary politics, in the sense of an understanding of capitalism and the vision of free society. As workers, we must again come to realize that the point of attack in the political struggle lies not in these legislative bodies, but in the people. In parliamentary politics, workers are in a bourgeois environment. They lack strength. It is as the producers of wealth, not as citizens, that we have real power. So, anarchism was born of the labour movement, and despite the detours of movementism, it's to the labour movement that we will slowly return. The question really is how this will be done, which I've attempted to point out in my recent article on the CFMEU riots. Generations of reductive and economist unionism has left a political void that means right-wing elements now have a foothold in the sectors of the construction industry. The fight back against this will involve tackling both the capitalists, the COVID crisis, and the union bureaucracy itself. Slow and patient organising at the rank and file, forming progressive alliances not limited by conservatism of the leadership. This rebuilding of a rank and file militant labour movement is the core task for anarchists and socialists in general. It is the most important aspect of how we'll build the capacity to solve the contradictions presented by COVID from a purely proletarian perspective.
Thanks a lot, Tommy. Ian?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Tommy. And yeah, look forward to hearing from Simon later on. Yeah, like Tommy, I'm coming to you from the land of the Yuggera people in what's now called Queensland. And yeah, pay respects to the elders past, present, and recognise the ongoing struggle for land rights and self-determination. I suspect maybe this particular panel, we're all on a bit on the same side, I think, of the general argument, the general discussion. Although I'm was happy to find the origin of the slogan, Tommy. Maybe that is a subject we can discuss a bit later on. But just to go over some of the things about coronavirus, for starters, I mean, I take it as read kind of that we all agree that the task of the left is to build a struggle against capitalism. It's the historical struggle. It's the struggle that's still ahead of us. And during coronavirus, it was no less necessary. I think, if anything, that it's not so much the right that has come out stronger out of the coronavirus crisis, but certainly I think it's much more right-wing social democracy has done. But anyway, maybe we can come back to that. With coronavirus, I think first to recognise is that I mean, I agree with Tommy in terms of its origins. To that extent, its origins may be in some natural phenomena, but there is the social phenomena that we've had to deal with. It is the social phenomena that we've had to deal with in terms of its response. So in terms of responding to to coronavirus, and I think the first thing we actually saw with that was, well, I'll come back to that, and what we've seen with the coronavirus crisis is that every rotten element of capitalism has been reinforced by the lockdown politics and the response of capitalist governments around the world. I'll kind of come back to that, but even if you look at the immediate responses, which were really about borders, the accusations of the China virus, the attempts to keep Chinese people out of Australia, to stop travel here. We saw that translated into various forms of border politics between various state politicians, but that immediate kind of racist element, which become magnified, I suppose, as things went on, actually, by Trump, and then Morrison's kind of echoes about the China virus and so on, was something that the left had to respond to kind of straight away and much more immediately. I think the other thing that we could see was that all the things that were associated with neoliberalism, the absolute priority of profit over human health, the defunding of hospitals, of public of public health, all those kinds of things also were part of the complete lack of preparation of a system, even though everyone recognised, I think, or the powers that be and people recognised the possibilities of the re-emergence of something like coronavirus. I mean, what we have seen in the bigger picture is that it has magnified that all those consequences of it's been a crisis of disadvantage, of inequality, of sort of unequal health systems, the casual eye workforce, of reinforcing the lack of the disadvantage associated with ethnic and racial minorities and so forth. So I mean, even the figure, I didn't go through all the figure, but you look at even at the UK, the fact that that poor people died at twice the rate of rich people actually says, and those similar figures are available no matter which country you look at, says everything about the impact of coronavirus. So I think from Solidarity's perspective, I think that the coronavirus actually was a particular demonstration of of neoliberal capitalism that had to be confronted, and to that respect, we've tried to find every way that we could to actually develop the struggle, even in the middle of that the difficulties of coronavirus. So we organised with international students against evictions and restrictions at the universities. We helped organise against with people resisting evictions. We explicitly organised, sometimes in solidarity, sometimes through the refugee movement and other movements, to organise resistance to the restrictions on the right to protest, the car cavalcades with trade unions, explicit challenges to actually organise protests, defying the restrictions of around the issues of refugees, and so forth. And I think that's that is the task of the left, and something that needed to be taken on. And as we come out of the coronavirus, if we can kind of say that the need for actually developing that struggle is as much as is greater than it ever was. So I think the first thing to recognise, or maybe I've said that already, but one of the things to recognise is that lockdowns are political, right? There's no, that the lockdowns they're orchestrated by the state authorities and by the employers. That they're the ones that define the terms of the lockdown, and what is going to be locked down, what isn't going to be locked down, and it's why. And again, I think it's going to be common ground here. We get such enormous differences in what is locked down, what's acceptable, not acceptable, even in one city, one state, and then between states. And that I think that those contradictions and the sheer hypocrisy sometimes is one of the things which really underpins a lot of the the growing discontent that we could see with the way the authorities actually went about the coronavirus. The pity of it was actually that it wasn't the left, which was as organised as it should be, to take advantage of that, to channel that disadvantage and to organise it in a progressive direction. But you could see the need to actually even organise against some of those things. Some of those things were obvious. The lockdown of the Melbourne flats, for example. I mean, it was just shocking authoritarian racism, which should have been completely opposed outright. The curfews are nonsense. The bans on assembling in parks, it's rubbish. So many things that were associated with lockdowns were simply about policing and reinforcing the capacity of the police to give them powers, to impose the things that they wanted to do. And you had amazing contradictions when it came to the Sydney lockdown, the recent Sydney lockdown, for example. On the one hand, you've got this massive casualised workforce, which capitalism in Sydney relies on, and they want them to go to work. And have got to make ways in which they can actually continue to go to the work. At the same time, you see the police power strengthened enormously to patrol parks, to patrol curfews, and all the rest of it. So I think the left had a responsibility to actually challenge the idea that somehow the lockdowns that were being imposed as a public health mechanism. I mean, public health is also a misused term. It's only public insofar as the state authorities want to impose certain things, and it is always about reinforcing and maintaining the existing social system and the people who are at the top of it. I should have kept a better idea on the time, Ryan. But we've got how many minutes?
You got 5 minutes left.
5, yeah, okay. So a couple of things which Tommy mentioned. I think the things which come out of it overwhelmingly are the increase in police powers, and no one on the left can take any sustenance from those increased in police powers. The tragedy was, as I said, we didn't see the left in the course of the coronavirus responding sufficiently. So it was the left seen as as a force which had an answer to those increased police powers. That the left was seen as objecting to the increased state power that we were seeing exercised over and over again. There were times when it happened more or less spontaneously. I mean, people remember the Black Lives Matter protests in Australia echoing the George Floyd things in in 2020 in June 2020. It looked for a moment that we are going to see the possibilities of actually large public protest actually challenge those police powers, to insist on the rights of social movements and of unionists and workers to actually exercise the right to protest. And as I tried to say before, I think that in one respect, that capacity to organise, to protest, to resist became even more important in the circumstances of COVID crisis, where not just where work was involved, not just that it was, but our very lives, our lives were involved. So I think that's and again we saw that over, and I don't need to go through it here, I don't think, either, with with the panel. The Redfern Legal Service was just one of the things that she pointed out. There were 28,000 fines issued in 2 months in 2021, 13 times all that was issued in 2020. They're in the process of challenging thousands of fines which are issued for people sitting on park benches, taking out wheelie bins, simply being black and out after 9 o'clock. So it's just one of those indications the way the police powers have been extended. And Tommy, I think also mentioned the horrific scenes we've seen in Melbourne, where the use of pepper spray, of various assault weapons, of armored cars and so on, the extent to which they've seized on the COVID crisis, and the demonstrations down there, right-wing demonstrations, perhaps anti-vax demonstrations, perhaps, but to normalise that kind of police brutality and police powers is going to something which the left has to take on. Okay, I think that one other thing I'll just mention, I think, which is also important, I think, because one of the things which comes with the lockdown, I think, is, and the way in which much of the pro-lockdown left, responded, was to simply to echo the calls of the capitalist class. Lockdown. Well, we need more lockdown. It needs to be harder. It needs to be more extensive. It needs to be more thorough. Which simply, in spite of sometimes small caveats on the end of those things, ended up reinforcing state power, and police power, when they're precisely the things that we need, that do need to be challenged. I think the other thing that it does, which is what kind of think one of the fundamental problems, is that it echoes a version of blame the victim. I mean, who was responsible ultimately for actually spreading the COVID crisis, for making the crisis much better? It wasn't ordinary people. It wasn't people sitting in parks or being out after 9 o'clock or anything else like that, or attempting to go to work. Aged care, it wasn't ordinary people that created the crisis in aged care, and I could go on in that respect. But the response, the general pro-lockdown response, meant that the finger wasn't pointed at the ultimate responsible of the capitalist class for the crisis, and it meant that the demands, which are absolutely crucial, end casualisation. I mean, that should be, thanks Ryan, that should have been a demand that was like absolutely hegemonic now, but it's not. It's an echo of its former self. We don't hear from Sally McManus around that so very much anymore. That was such a big feature at the start of the crisis. All those kinds of things, getting rid of the privatized aged care, the taking over the private hospitals and putting them under public control, advancing job seeker, and any casualisation I've mentioned, the privatization, the things about public transport, expanding all those things, I think, which were exposed as absolute necessities for life and for working class power in the COVID crisis, should have been magnified. We should have come out stronger, to do it. I just want to end on two quick things, I think, also, which Tommy mentioned, that one of the things I think we've also seen magnified globally is the inequality. The advanced capitalist countries doing quite well. The vaccine nationalism is just a disgusting, obscene element of neoliberal capitalism. The fact that the Morrison government could be talking about shutting down the AstraZeneca, or allowing the AstraZeneca factory to shut in Melbourne when there's such a crying need for vaccine, world level, is well, hopefully we'll see him in The Hague, at some point, with other, along with a lot of list of crimes. Anyway, time to wind up in that respect. That, as I think I wind up, that COVID has exposed the flaws of capitalism, and I think as we come out of it, we need to recognise that we have got more reasons actually to get rid of capitalism, to organise against capitalism, than we had when coronavirus first emerged. When was it? The beginning of 2020, and there's so many ways in which even the nuclear subs, for example, simply can keep making the point. How many public hospitals can one nuclear sub buy? And it's those kinds of things which can rebuild the left, which can point to who is responsible for the ongoing crisis of capitalism, point to the possibilities I think we agree on about. We do need workers' power. We need a real challenge to the system in Australia and globally.
Thanks so much, Ian. Simon?
Hello. I'm just going to press my little timer so I can keep a track of how I'm going. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra, what's known as Canberra here. Pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and of course acknowledge that this land has never been ceded and that we will never have any form of reconciliation or peace until we have a treaty and proper truth-telling. I'd like to say thank you also, Ryan, for postponing this event. And this was supposed to be last week. It was me who caused the postponement. I had an immediate family emergency that happened last week. All is okay now, which is good. But I had to travel to Melbourne very quickly, and was very thankful for borders opening because otherwise I'd be in quarantine now or unable to have gotten there. And it sort of has made me reflect again on one of the challenges that the left has had during the coronavirus pandemic, a movement that I think should be for open borders, and where open borders for me is something as a kind of core principle, but where so many have reflexively defended closed borders to the point of cruelty has been really disappointing, and accepting it without any questions has been a really disappointing thing for me. And I'm thankful that has changed slightly now, that I was able to visit family in a time of need. My comments, I'm going to focus primarily on the fourth question that Ryan has asked us, which is how should a political left react toward the growth of state power over civil society that has resulted from the handling of the pandemic? I think Tommy and Ian have really done a lot of really great stuff about the causes of coronavirus. I agree with a lot of what they've had to say, and I'm looking forward to those discussions. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the response from the left to this. In particular, I want to respond to some of the responses from what I would call the institutional left. And I say this specifically because I think the left is a broad church. There's lots of different people across this, and the people I'm going to be criticizing here, and I don't think are people who are in this room, in this Zoom room, but represent a sort of mainstream version of the left. The people like people in the Labor Party, people higher up in the Greens, in think tanks, and in the higher ups of a lot of the union movement, who I think have adopted similar positions in the response to coronavirus, and I think that they've been really problematic and have actually caused a range of serious problems, and that's what I wanted to address today. In some ways, and people have pointed this out to me on Twitter when I've been talking about it, a lot of these people aren't left. They're probably neoliberal centre-right, but I'll call them left because that's how they call themselves, and we can have that discussion we can have that debate in the discussion if we want, but we'll call them left, and so when I'm referring to left, I mean them. A lot of this thinking has come as well from the Melbourne protest that happened a couple of months ago, or a month ago, I don't know, time doesn't feel real at the moment, which obviously started in elements. It started in elements of the working class, in construction workers, and we kind of forget that before the big protest, there were these tea room protests when tea rooms got shut down, and workers actually went onto the street and set up their tea rooms, which I consider a major OH&S issue. If you're outside working all day, you have right to a space to be in all the time, to be able to go and escape the elements, and the Victorian government shut those down really quickly, and resulted in peaceful protests in response to that. And what we saw with those protests that kind of started around some of these issues develop, target the union, who was seen to be more aligned with the Dan Andrews government, and then co-opted very heavily from the far right, who managed to take that energy and turn it into something else. And so I was interested about what has been happening, particularly because from anecdotes and from research, and I think, Tommy, you've spoken about this as well, the far right has had inroads into the construction industry in particular. And what has happened where a working class base has blue collar working class base, often heavily male dominated, how have they sort of been turning to the right a little bit more, and how do we respond to those sorts of things? Of course, this is everybody, and it's still a relatively small movement of people who are in the far right in Australia. It's still a small segment of the construction industry. It's still a small segment of people who are out there protesting. The vast majority of people in the construction industry are pro-vaccination, for example. There's a small number of people who are anti-vax and who are out there protesting, but it represents a level of frustration that I think the left and the far left in particular need to reckon with, because from my perspective, we're not responding in some ways as strongly as could be. And in that vacuum, there's the potential that the far right will take up more of this frustration that the left in general should be able to galvanize. Part of that, and this is where I'll come to my critique, and part of that is because of the way in which these mainstream lefties have sort of dominated debate, and the way our difficulties in separating ourselves from them and presenting something different. So what's going on? Well, I think from my research, I do a lot of research into the far right, into misogyny online, a little bit into the far right in Australia, and we know that there is a strong tendency of people who join the far right, often due to social alienation and real disconnect from society. That's been found around the world, that often ideology comes second. What actually comes first is connection to group, connection to people who listen, and people who are willing to say, yes, you have these frustrations and I agree with you, and I'm willing to take to listen and then direct that energy into something else. This social alienation is something that's happening in Australia really strongly. So I do some research into anti-politics, which is just a general frustration. It can be described as sort of general anger and frustration at politics, and it's happening around the world. We know that this has been strongly associated with the rise of Donald Trump, for example, the Brexit vote. In Australia, we did some research here with some colleagues that found growing distrust in our political systems and our politicians in general. I think many people here would think that that's a good thing, that we should have distrust in the state. We should have distrust in the power of the state. We should have distrust in capitalism. We should be seeing the links between capitalism and the state. And that is a positive thing that we want to harness. And I think it is something we want to harness to sort of create a bit more of an anti-state and anti-capitalist left, an anti-capitalist movement. But what my analysis is, what I'm arguing is that these kind of mainstream left have really done the opposite and have actually sort of turned more and more into becoming the elite that many of these people are reacting against. And this has happened in a number of different ways. So Jeff Sparrow talks about a smug politics in the left, one in which people in mainstream institutions have become sort of elevated themselves to a position of elite, and particularly through a technocratic approach, have decided that the working class are a problem that need to be dealt with rather than people who we should have solidarity with and people we should bind together with. And so this is particularly true. People are seen as, the poor working class. They don't know what they're doing. We see a lot of political parties that want to have control and sense control as the need for this. And this really happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw, I think Ian spoke about this, the desire for control over populations and blaming individuals for the spread of the disease instead of blaming systems for it. So, if you went out to a park, you were blamed for the spread of the disease rather than the capitalist who is not creating a healthy workplace and still demanding people to come into the workplace at that point of time. And so this kind of smug politics that blames the working class for things. And we saw this during the protests as well. So Dan Andrews, I'm sure everybody's favorite politician, he called he called people man baby. They call them man baby Nazis. So that was Bill Shorten who called protesters man baby Nazis. Brett Sutton accused protesters of living in a fantasy world and saying that they're not rational individuals. They're absolutely wacky, really elevating themselves above these people and the concerns that they have. I think the second thing that's happened is we have a growing reliance on the state from much of this institutional left. And I think, Tommy, you mentioned this in terms of the union. So the unions in general, and this is a real frustration of mine, since the Accords of the 1980s have really seen their position as being sitting at the table and negotiating with the state, and campaigning has focused heavily on getting the Labor Party elected, with the belief that if we just get the Labor Party elected, then all will be okay, even when they introduce draconian anti-strike laws, even when they clearly show that they have no desire to look after workers in any kind of way or to work with workers. And this, I think, has also happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, in which we've seen a reliance on the state, and a reflective reliance on the state that means that people have assumed that we should rely on the state straight away and never questioned it. And when people have questioned what the state has been doing, they've been told by elements of the left that all they want to do is let the disease spread. They want to let it rip. And I think the police power stuff has been one of the most frustrating elements of this for me. So we saw high-profile mainstream lefties, I'll put them in inverted commas, during right-wing protests, come out and applaud the use of police violence, applaud the use of police, say that the police are there to protect us, when they've been using these extraordinarily violent means to bring down these protests. And it's been very frustrating watching that. The same people who did that, who at the time defended Black Lives Matter protests, as they should have, and then come and attack the other protests because we don't like the means in which they're doing it. And there's a contradiction there that plays out really strongly. And so I think what's happening here is I think the far right can do a very good job of sort of tapping into these fears and really tapping in and listening to people with these real concerns, and this sort of anti-state, this anti-political rhetoric, and the far right have done a really good job of that. Donald Trump did an excellent job of that in the United States. The Brexit people did an excellent job of that in the UK in 2016. And you see this rhetoric play out in the far right in Europe as well, particularly in places like France, Sweden, where they have made significant gains in this kind of anti-establishment rhetoric. And so how do we, briefly, I've got 1 minute left, some response to what we might need to think about doing as a left. I think both Tommy and Ian have already touched on some of these ideas, so I'm not going to go into them in super depth, but we have to return to a sort of materialist understanding of how we respond and try and opt out of these culture wars that I think many elements of the mainstream left love to engage in. And so I think Ian suggested a number of these: end casualisation, ensure we have strong income support and a strong welfare system. Around coronavirus, workplace OH&S has to be a major thing, and ensuring that our workplaces are safe, not just for this pandemic, but in the future as well, because we know that that's a major problem. And focus on the health system. I think Ian said how many nuclear subs could build a hospital. But I think also you've seen states that have had real problems with their healthcare system, and they've been having those problems now, despite knowing for 18 months that outbreaks could happen and not investing at any point of time across that period. So we had the ridiculous situation where Western Australia was shutting down elective surgery, even though they had no cases, because of fears of future cases, and they wanted to get their system ready. Now, that shouldn't be the case. We should have money in the system already, and they should have been prepared for a long time. And finally, I think we can develop a better counter narrative or alternative narrative to what the right is presenting to people, recognizing the kernel of truth of the fears of many people have, particularly the genuine reasons people have to be angry at governments. I think we all probably agree with that in many ways here on this panel. In the case of COVID, that could have meant focusing more on local solutions rather than thinking of top-down. Everything needs to be done through a top-down, hierarchical, governments implement sort of draconian measures kind of solution. In recognizing the emotional pull of politics as well and engaging with that. And finally, I think I want to say that we need to have a focus on ensure that the left is a space of belonging as well. And I think that so much of what the far right does in particular is does a good job of allowing people to belong into spaces. They have very narrow views of what that is. It's obviously a white space, and so some people don't belong. But for those particular people, they create a sense of belonging. And I think much of the left is not particularly belonging. It doesn't do a good job of welcoming people in. People are often in many of these spaces, in many of these smug spaces, they're chastised constantly for doing the wrong thing. And it's not particularly helpful. There's no theory of change in how we bring people along with us, because the moment you do something wrong, you're kind of pushed out in many spaces. And I think that is something we really seriously need to address as the left. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Simon, and to the other speakers. Just to give the speakers a moment to collect their thoughts before we go to responses, I'll ask any members in the audience who have questions either to type them into the Q&A box or just into the chat. And then after the responses, I'll read out select questions, and hopefully we can get to all of them if we have time. Just to comment and sort of summarize some of your positions, I think a few things that came up in commonality was how that neoliberalism presented certain difficulties in organizing the left. Sort of paradoxically, while workers are facing much more uncertain conditions, there was talked about casualization, there was mentions of the tea rooms, and particularly also the nature of vaccine mandates, which came up, I think, between Tommy and Ian. So one question I would ask for your consideration is, how does the left respond to vaccine mandates? How does it respond to casualization and the relation between the two? How does the left think about and concentrate on this question of the neoliberalization of the workforce and how the certain policies that have come down relating to industrial relations, whether it's mandates or whether it's contractor rates in industry. So maybe just that to think about as well as we sum up, but let's go back to Tommy for your responses.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thanks, Ian and Simon. I really enjoyed listening to both of you, and I think it was, as Ian put it, there's a lot of commonality in our positions here. So it's yeah, good going into a friendly discussion. Particularly, I really like the way at the end, Simon, you put it that what we need is a materials response rather than cultural wars. But I guess, yeah, I think the one thing that continually recurs to me with all of this and what we're discussing is that as much as we can envision the way that the left wants to respond, what we want to do, that's really a question of what kind of power and capacity do we have. Like, one thing that's really been illustrated by this entire pandemic and crisis is that we just haven't had the power to enforce any of our ideas. You know, Ian touched on sort of the car convoy protests at the beginning. You know, we did some of those in Melbourne as well. And then, yeah, we went into hard lockdown. And that sort of leads me to one of the first things that I think maybe might be a bit of a difference. So having been through all the lockdowns, I guess, the Melbourne having been through a number more than Sydney, I guess, at least in the first instance, we saw how effective that was when the numbers were out of control. And so I wasn't even working during the first one. I lost my job at the beginning. I wasn't going anywhere. I was still, you know, like in complete lockdown, wearing a mask, sanitizer, everything. And I managed to get coronavirus just by going to Woolworths. So I think, like, we have to avoid running the risk of playing down just how contagious and dangerous the virus is, because it is pretty serious. And I think that there is a social scope for lockdowns. I wouldn't be so knee-jerk anti-lockdown without, while at the same time, I would definitely say that most of Ian's critiques I agree with, you know, about how it's giving police powers, how all lockdowns are politically shaped by whose interests. And I think that one thing that's really telling is the difference between, say, the first lockdowns in Victoria and the second one. So, you know, we saw the withdrawing of federal funding to Victoria for the second lockdown, and we struggled to contain numbers because the government, you know, the limited capacity that the Andrews government then had, I suppose. I'm sure they could have done a hell of a lot more, and I would, you know, first to critique what they got wrong. There was a lot less money going to people to stay home. What was defined as essential became completely different because, yeah, you know, if we really could strip down to what was essential, then we had a lot more capacity to contain the virus. I think the most telling example was there was like a Chanel store in Melbourne that was still open during lockdown 2, but there's no way that would have been open at lockdown 1. And I guess it also makes me think, I have a question for Ian, you know, what does he think perhaps lockdown, or Simon as well, what would lockdown look like? And would we employ it if we're, you know, in a situation run by workers' councils, or where we had a lot more workers' power to define these things? I mean, I know it's just a big thought experiment, but yeah, I think it's worth engaging with, because there's a pretty big, you know, health matters. And then, yeah, so with the vaccine mandates, so Ryan was bringing that up at the end, I think the one thing that gets underplayed in the responses to the vaccine mandates you know, we talk about the sort of like right-wing influence on the construction industry and other sectors of society. I think, well, for a start, that one of the biggest mistakes that we had was that it wasn't the unions calling for mandates, actually, that it was state implemented rather than worker implemented. But one of the positive things to come out of it, I think, is that the same, at least this is certainly my subjective experience, the same people that were on site who had fairly anti-union views, even though they were paying, you know, their dues on, I was working in unionized industry at the time, they were the first ones, to criticize the union. They were the first they were the ones that were ostracized, I suppose, when they were marginalized, sorry, is what I'm trying to say. They were marginalized by the vaccine mandates because they were taken off the job. So the left voices became a lot stronger on site. And certainly after the riots, a lot of people who might have been more sympathetic to right-wing opinions beforehand suddenly became extremely anti-right-wing. Yeah. I think I might just leave it there. I could probably use more time to write down notes for my thoughts, but yeah, those are a few thoughts. I really enjoyed everything. Thanks.
Thanks, Tommy. Ian, for your responses.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Tommy, and thanks, Simon. I find it a bit hard to know where to start. Actually, I mean, in one respect, I wouldn't mind starting where Tommy ended, and maybe that's one of the more controversial bits of it. I hadn't heard that kind of report about the consequence on a building site, for example. My concern, and certainly with the why kind of wrote the article about the don't scab, the get the jab, and the concerns I have about that kind of slogan was that it may well be, as you've described, that what's left on the building site's a little bit more left wing. My concern is what's happened to the people who've been pushed off. In the same way as Simon kind of raised, it just seems to me that the general kind of left response and union response to what happened with the CFMEU was simply to create a very large audience for the right wing, which we saw in an immediate way. I mean, there's the idea, well, first to say that they certainly were not all right wingers outside the CFMEU offices, but nonetheless, the next day there was clearly a capacity for the right to play a disproportionate role in leading a lot of disgruntled building workers around Melbourne. Now, thankfully, that dropped off quite dramatically. By the time we get to the end of the week, it's the same ragtag, bunch of right wingers that we're more used to, but the audience that had been created, I think you could visually see on the streets of Melbourne, and that's my concern about those kinds of slogans and the attitudes, the kind of equivalence that someone who is vaccine hesitant as a burgeoning fascist, I think is the kind of thing which pushes people into the arms of the right. The way in which Simon, perhaps he could expand a bit on that, but I think it's right. That unless the left has an answer, not just in terms of welcomingness, what the word, the ability to welcome. I agree with what he says about that. I think it is particularly important. But it's an indicator about why the left has to be a voice for that alienation and that discontent, and to understand where that marginalization comes from. And I think in that respect, and we probably all, I'm sure we all agree here, I mean, it's the weakness of the left in being able to provide that that voice. That's something we have to recognize and do what we can to as a space to fill. And I think that's where my concerns also about mandatory vaccination come from. Like, it's very, very clear, that there's no necessity in terms of dealing with COVID in the community for mandatory vaccination. And you have got a that the levels of vaccination have been achieved. And it's great that it has. I'm certainly pro-vaccination, encourage people to get vaccination, all the rest of it, but it's been achieved because of the general situation in society. I mean, whatever Sydney or whatever New South Wales will end up 90%, and in fairly short order, probably go to 95%. But you can see some of the the same blame the victim elements, which I think are very, very dangerous, and the differences between different states, in the same way over borders and different elements of what's a lockdown is and what isn't, emerges over that mandatory, vaccination. I mean, it's very clear that Dan Andrews has resorted to a very widespread vaccination mandate as to try to build up the numbers. Because he's certainly got no confidence in the, in ordinary people, the sensibilities of ordinary people, the capacity of genuine public health, of encouragement by unions, et cetera, to raise that particular level. Mandatory vaccination was a quick way for him to try and get a certain level of vaccination because they were so far behind in the vaccine rollout and everything else. Queensland's even worse, in that respect. But there's a big difference. We're not seeing the mandatory vaccination in Queensland in the same kind of way, to the same extent you are in Victoria. And I don't think that can be. Well, put it the other way, it can only be explained, I think, by the way that the Labor parties in each state are actually looking at the base. A greater degree of vaccine hesitancy here, the great amount of difficulties. They've already got a problem with the number of cops who aren't doing it. They stood down 2,000 public health workers now, but they recognise they've got a general problem. But anyway, as I said, if we leave the reason about the mandatory vaccination, if you simply allow the space, the right wing to give the space to the mandatory vaccination, then again it's creating an audience for the right that the left has got nothing to say about. I mean, I've got very, very particular concerns about the don't scab, get the jab, because I do think it's one of the things which actually undermines some of the very fundamental things that's serious about scabbing, and what that to accuse someone who's vaccine hesitant of actually being a scab, of collaborating with the boss, of undermining the union, I think trivializes scabbing, and does a bit of the same thing. It does push those people towards the right that shouldn't be. I think there was lockdown. Just to touch finally on the lockdown element. I think it's a very interesting thought experiment about but I think for the sake of this discussion about what would a worker state actually do about coronavirus. I mean the first thing we do would be have genuine public health things in place. But I think the idea that there are certain things which are obviously sensible. You wash your hands. The question of socially distance. We all know how coronavirus is actually spread. You can look at the way in which work would operate. The fact that we'd have genuine control over the way that work would happen would mean we wouldn't have to have the kinds of struggles that happened episodically and sporadically when bosses were trying to force people to work in safe conditions. We wouldn't have a casualised workforce, and we wouldn't have a privatised workforce in aged care. You could provide the social resources that you needed to create socially distance and et cetera, but that element of common sense in that respect, the question of socially distance and understanding how coronavirus is spread, is important to understand, that about how that can be implemented. I don't think it's a matter of, but I think the failure of the left in this experience is to somehow equate, the state's capacity to lock down with some kind of rational kernel of a response. And I think it undermines the basic thing, which I think socialists have to say, that the lockdown, it is political. What is lockdown, how it's locked down. You just think about all the stuff about the essential workers. Who's essential. That they decided who was essential. We didn't decide who was essential. What input do we have in the lockdown? Were the unions consulted about the lockdown? Were community groups consulted about the lockdown? What was possible in Western Sydney? Whether did they have meetings with the in the mosques in the suburbs? No.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Simon?
Okay. There's lots of really interesting stuff here, and lots of things to talk about. I think we could, and I will touch on it briefly, we could spend the whole night just debating the value of lockdowns or not. And I think that's an interesting question, and one that we have to grapple with potentially for in the future, although I suspect in terms of coronavirus, I see politically it becoming very difficult for Australia to ever enter back into lockdowns, particularly in New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT that are coming out of this. After 2 years of lockdowns, it would have to be something very dramatic, I think, to see particularly Victoria and New South Wales go back into lockdown. You know, new variants, real spread, something along those lines, particularly with such high vaccination rates. So in some ways, this debate is kind of a little bit past, is what I'm trying to get at. But I think it's worth touching on a couple of points here. I think in the question chats, Gemma asked, how do we balance the needs of the privileges in our society balanced with those who are immunocompromised or at higher risk of death if getting infected? And I think I'm generally are very critical of lockdowns, but I don't think that means that we let it rip. And there's been a false binary that has been created in many of these debates that suggests that it's either hard lockdown on one end or letting it rip on the other. And in fact, one of my major frustrations, the things that have made me very angry with the response of the far right, the response of the Liberal Party in Victoria in particular, is that heading down this conspiracy theory approach has meant that we have this kind of narrative that if you ever question lockdowns or are critical of them, you're automatically associated with this kind of far right element, and you're wanting to let it rip, and that's quite frustrating. I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but it has been something that's happened in a lot of debates. But what I would say is that lockdowns are very heavily resource intensive, and they require the huge resources of the state to implement and to enforce, often in many spaces for little gain. So I think particular, we've seen things like curfews, outdoor bans are often, we know that coronavirus spreads indoors much more quickly than outdoors. Even the banning of shops. So Tommy, you mentioned Chanel being opened. We know that casual contacts via shops are much lower. They're not impossible. It's not impossible, but they're much lower than places in homes. In homes, we know is where it happens. In workplaces where people are close together, factory floors, those kinds of things is where we know it's happened. Aged care homes is where it's spread a lot. So what I would argue is that we need to be thinking more actively about where do diseases spread, how do they spread, and how can we minimize the capacity of that spreading in those places. And I actually know that it happens indoors more than outdoors. And so lockdowns in some ways revert the problem by somehow blaming outdoors for it and encouraging people to be indoors more, when actually it's indoors where it's happening all the time, when spread is happening more frequently. And this is where I found 1 hour, one of the things that happened in many states is that, you can only have exercise for 1 hour outside, when in fact, people being outdoors is safer, much, much safer. And it would be encouraging people to be outdoors is actually better. Encouraging ventilation is a thing that we could be doing, and that's something we should be doing now. We at my university, I've just moved into a new building last year, which has no ventilation at all, no capacity to open any windows, no capacity to do anything. If a disease was to spread through that place, it would go like wildfire because it's all goes through the ducted system. It happens quickly. So encouraging things like better OH&S in these kind of places, for me, is a higher priority than the sort of reactive thinking that lockdown will just solve it. And I think one of my fears now is that with this outbreak, we're going to have a situation in which governments feel like, well, we don't need to do anything to create these systems, to boost our healthcare system, to boost, to make places safer, because they'll go, well, there's an outbreak of a disease in the future, another pandemic, let's just lock down, that's the solution. We've done it in the past, that's all we need to do. Sort of short, sharp pain rather than having to do long-term solutions. And I think we need to be careful on the left in not engaging in that debate, and engaging in a debate now about what we can do to make places safer for future pandemics if and when they arise. We also know that a lot of these things, like having a better healthcare system, is good in general, and it's a very popular demand, and one that we could be making really quite strongly. I want to touch on mandates as well. I'm like strongly opposed to mandates, and one of the things that we've had a lot of people take a lot of lessons, in particular from the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And one of the lessons that came from that around public health messaging was that a lot of sticks were used in that regards, not quite mandates, but because there wasn't effective treatment at the time, but a lot of stuff around safe sex messaging, the kind of very scary messaging that comes from that. And we saw the federal government here try to do something similar with that atrocious ad that they released of the the footage of a woman breathing very heavily. And we know that that doesn't work. The evidence all shows that it doesn't work. It makes people feel stigmatized, it makes people feel fearful about their behaviors. And it means that when people don't do these things or break the rules by mistake, that they're less likely to come forward, they're less likely to engage in the health system. We also know that there are a range of people who are rightfully very cynical of the medical system. So think of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who have been faced a huge amount of abuse from the Australian medical system. And I would say many are rightfully very wary of the potential of getting a vaccination because of that history. And vaccine mandates doesn't take that into account. There's got to be more work done in encouraging people and fixing our healthcare system and fixing those histories of abuse before we demand people get it, particularly in Australia, as Ian said, in a context in which we have such high vaccine uptake. In the ACT, where I am, I've been very thankful that the government hasn't implemented vaccine mandates, because we are now at literally above 100% of first dose uptake. Now, that is partially because we also have vaccinated a lot of people from the regional area, so not everyone in Canberra is literally vaccinated, but we have such high vaccine rates in Australia. Now, in New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT in particular, we're now heading to be some of the highest, most highly vaccinated people in the world. Mandates aren't necessary at this point in time to deal with this outbreak. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to discuss a bunch of other stuff. I think there are some other questions about the right, which we can talk about at some point. But just give me 1 second. I'm just going to turn my light on because it's getting too dark.
Thanks, Simon. I was just wondering if either Tommy or Ian wanted to reply to that last question, because I wasn't entirely sure if you had a concrete position on vaccine mandates. Were you pro or anti-vaccine, or is it a question of who is implementing the vaccine mandate? No, sorry, not pro vaccine, but vaccine mandate for workers.
So, well, no, I'm definitely against vaccine mandate.
Bit of a tough one. I wouldn't say I'm 100% for the mandate in all situations. I think like what Simon raised in particular, about concerns of Indigenous communities are very valid, but I definitely, I don't know. I feel like in the workplace that it would be really good if we had a means by which, we could mandate it for workers. So, there's a few examples that have been going around of people having problems with the mandates or whatnot. I was speaking to a friend yesterday, and at his school, a number of AU members resigned from the union because the union wouldn't mandate vaccines because they don't want to be working somewhere that they're unsafe. And then I have another friend who's leading some industrial struggle down here at the moment, and the one co-worker that won't get the vaccine is the one who hides in the cupboard so that he doesn't have to work. So, I think that like I said, someone else came up with the slogan, "Don't scab, get the jab," but it was part of a discussion that I was in, and then I brought that to CAF, and that's how that slogan came about. And I think that there's just a reality to it that in the workplace, certainly, and even in a broader sense of the community, if you're not getting the vaccine, then you're undermining everyone else's safety and health. And I think that needs to be reiterated. I think that maybe, taking it and turning it into some kind of contention between the boss and worker is actually overthinking and overcomplicating the slogan. The point is just that collective health is what matters.
Yeah, sorry, but I think if the point comes up with what Simon had to say, I think as well, is that there's a factual thing at the moment, that someone being unvaccinated on a site is not a risk to public health and to health on the thing. And the collective element is there's no the collective element that we can have as a class and on a work site is against the boss. Right, and I think that in that respect, pointing at some unvaccinated worker when you've got a boss that's not providing PPE, which is not providing, vax leave, which is not providing sick leave or whatever, that's the fundamental problem. Is that instead of actually who is the real danger in this situation? It should, as Simon's gone over, if we don't come out of this campaigning hard, to get rid of privatise health, for expanded public health, to deal with casualisation, to get, job seeker, as a living wage, etc., etc. That's where the COVID danger lies, not in someone who's unvaccinated. And I think it's a clever slogan perhaps, but it points in the wrong direction. And as I said before, for the people who are unvaccinated on the thing, we'll know, perhaps in the coming weeks and months to see to what extent, it has created an audience for the right. But that's the danger. Instead of drawing that person in, welcoming that some person in, quite a different thing. I think someone who's, you go on strike to have enough space for it to have an expanded tea room where you can socially distance safely, or where you can have a proper filter in the air conditioner in your tea room, instead of allowing Dan Andrews to shut them down. Someone who sides with the boss against that, sure, they're a scab. But someone who says, well, look, I'm not so sure about the vaccine, that's a worried worker, and someone who we should be pulling on side and collective action.
I don't think I agree with that distinction, but I don't think that concerning ourselves with someone being unvaccinated means that we give up on all the other issues of OH&S. Like for the example, the friend that I have that's leading industrial struggle in Geelong, one of the things we were talking about is how they could employ concerns about OH&S and coronavirus and capacity limits as part of the industrial struggle. Again, I don't think that that's something that means we put those things to the side whatsoever. And I completely agree with, that we need to be focusing on what the real problem is and who the enemy is, in the broader sense, that so much of this really falls on the bosses. But I don't think that that means that we need to say it's okay for someone who's unvaccinated to come to work with us and risk spreading it. I mean, you're talking about it's not being a risk. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head which website I read it on, and that doesn't exactly sound like a glowing endorsement, but I do remember coming across an article the other day that we are, I think it's 20 times, maybe even more likely to catch coronavirus from someone who's unvaccinated than someone who is. And we all know that you can still get coronavirus if you are vaccinated. It's not a fail-safe sort of thing. I mean, that's the whole beauty of herd immunity, right? That concept that everyone has.
Herd immunity does assume some people won't be vaccinated. So herd immunity doesn't kick in only at 100% of vaccination rates. And so I think this is the important thing where we're at the moment in the Australian context, in which we have such, and this is different to places like the UK and the US, which have stalled at 60 to 70% of vaccination rates. Australia, we're lucky and we're not at that stage. And so again, in many ways, I think that there was interesting debates about mandatory vaccinations at earlier stages in this, but particularly in the southeastern states now, we just don't have a need for vaccine mandates because we have shot through the roof in terms of our vaccine uptake. Partially that has been, I think in many ways it's been because of the lockdowns and the kind of promises of getting out of lockdowns through vaccines. And I think that was a positive messaging that really that these states have done, and I think it was very good when Victoria, for example, when Dan Andrews turned that messaging around and turned it towards more vaccines rather than getting back to COVID zero, as a recognition that vaccines were our way out of this. But at this stage in our debate, in the debate, basically having one person on a site it's very rare. It's very unlikely that it's going to create a major outbreak, because the vaccine uptake is so high in the rest of our community. It would be weird for them to get in the first place, and this is why we're seeing, particularly in the ACT and New South Wales, we're seeing rates drop dramatically, and I suspect you'll see similar in Victoria pretty soon. I'm not an epidemiologist, but we are seeing that happen, and that's a really positive thing. We're at the stage now where vaccine uptake is so high that mandates are not needed.
Okay, maybe at that point we'll pause on the question of mandates, and it might come up again in the question and answer. The first question I wanted to take was from Michael McClelland, and Michael, if you want to, I'll give you a second to ask it yourself. if you want to say it out loud.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so the question was, just scrolling up so I can actually read what I actually wrote. I wanted to know what the panelists thought about the question of who or what is organizing the right. And I recognize that it's a pretty broad question, so just to narrow the scope a bit, I'm kind of asking that in the sense of relative to this historical moment when it seems that so many people have such a great interest in the causes of the left. Why do you see it that so many are taking up the cause of the right? Like, to what, if the right is a gravity well, like what's there? Is it a presence? Is it an absence? Is there like some force? And, you know, in mind of the fact that we can't say it's Trump anymore because he's gone, does anyone have any thoughts or reflections on that?
Thanks, Michael. Would anyone like to respond first?
I can respond briefly.
Okay, Simon, then Ian.
I think it is different in different parts of the world. So you mentioned Trump. We know, in the US there is this, has been since in the modern era. Obviously, we've seen since since Obama, we saw the Tea Party movements. This kind of which kind of morphed into a form of Trumpism, which is this very strongly anti-establishment version of the right that has played out really heavily, strongly linked, although not all entirely made up of white supremacist movements. I know that someone, I can't remember who, made a comment about that. The right isn't entirely white. I agree with that. When I made that comment in my remarks, I was focusing specifically on elements of the far right that are strongly whitely supremacist. So that's happened in places in like the US and the UK, and it's happening in Europe as well. I think Australia is a different kettle of fish. We try to adopt, elements of the right. So I'm thinking about like Cory Bernardi, Pauline Hanson, these kind of figures often try to adopt the rhetoric of the US, and you can watch them do that. They'll bring in these things. Sky News loves to do it as well. Bring in these ideas and test them and try to adopt these things, but they often fail. We don't have as strong a social base for that really far right groundswell that has happened in other parts of the world. And we're lucky in that way that we haven't faced that. And I think partially that's because in some places our social welfare net hasn't collapsed as much as it has in the US. The union movement is I would certainly say weak here, but there is still some presence. Those sorts of, we haven't seen some of that collapse of the social base of the political parties as well, which has happened in the US in particular, but also in Europe, where many of the old parties are completely collapsing, seeing record low votes. That all hasn't happened so much in Australia. So a lot of it is actually led by a range of high-profile figures that kind of keep coming around. And in Melbourne, you've seen people like Avi Yamini who are trying to emulate some of these ideas. Avi Yamini really is trying to become one, similar to like Lauren Southern or some of these other far-right figures in the US and Canada. This kind of sensationalist journalism where they go on the street and start all of these different provocations and then try to get a bunch of publicity for it. I think what concerned me about the protests in Melbourne and what's concerned me about COVID is the potential that they'll be gaining a little bit more steam. But I don't think that there are a gravity pull like we've seen in the UK or the US or parts of Europe. We just haven't seen that yet. And a lot of the rhetoric in Australia about the far right being on the rise and exploding, I think, is overblown and is we have to be careful of that as well. Even though I spent most of my talk talking about it, we have to be careful of that because I don't think it is anywhere like what's happened in the US or other parts of the world. I'm not sure if that answers it entirely, but it gives some sense.
Ian?
Yeah, look, I agree entirely. There's big differences in different parts of the world. I think you look at somewhere like the Netherlands, for example, and you can actually see the way in which the right has gone from taking up the questions of, of COVID and the anti-lockdown position, and tiny initially, perhaps scores, perhaps hundreds. Now they can have demonstrations of some thousands, and the reason I kind of raise that is that I do think one of the common things everywhere is the failure of the left. I mean, the right grows when the left, doesn't respond. Where did Trump come from? Trump come from the failure of the Democrats. And then we could see exactly the same thing happen again with the failure, of Biden and the expectations. Although I was going to raise this a little bit later on somewhere perhaps, but I think the answer to that will be if we see the development of the strike wave in the United States. At least part of the answer will be when unions and ordinary workers actually start to take into their own control some of the things which they've been willing to leave to the Democrats in the past. But I make the same point that I tried to make earlier, that it's the failure of the left to deal with casualisation. Why have we got even in Tommy's industry? The fact is that the CFMEU has been too cosy with employers. To be too concerned about keeping the industry open and not about fighting for a safe industry, too willing to accept, that a kind of a tight core of organised places which have enterprise bargain agreements, but around it is a whole lot of casualisation of labour hire. You look at and you can see the same thing, like I think in so many cases that it's the failure of the union movement to actually respond to those historical, traditional kind of challenges. Actually, I was going to raise it with, with Simon, his experiences with the, with the NTU, which are now in a round of enterprise bargaining, needing to actually deal with the issues of casualisation, which have been a major issue. And it's astonishing when you think that casualisation is such an issue in the tertiary sector, but it's also true, kind of elsewhere. So I think that's why it raised. I agree with Simon absolutely. I don't think we should exaggerate the right in Australia. It's still relatively tiny. I think the thing is that it needs to be kept there, and that does mean taking up the bigger issues. Our big fights at the moment are with Morrison, are with Christensen, are with to the extent we've still got a union movement, which is severely diminished, but it still has got a capacity to respond where it's organised, and that can make a hell of a difference in showing that the left actually can respond to the questions of casualisation. That's why the questions of the strike laws and stuff needs to be taken up. The nurses at least have raised the issues about ratios in in aged care and in public health. That needs to be encouraged. I think we need to get across the fact that COVID has actually meant that workers are in a stronger position, should be in a stronger position, are in a stronger position if they kind of understand that. And just quickly go back to the question of the mandatory vaccination issue. You see, like in Queensland at the moment, they're worried about the public health system. There's been no COVID in Queensland with borders opening. Initially, Anastasia Palaszczuk was criticising Morrison and demanding more money for the public health system. She's dropped that now. There may well be problems with the public health situation, but is the issue people who haven't got vaccination in Queensland, or is it the fact that Anastasia Palaszczuk has done nothing about the public health system, with all the time that she's had to prepare, all the time they've talked about it? If there's a problem with the public health system, it won't be unvaccinated people that's responsible.
Thanks. And just Tommy, if you want to quickly comment on that, if you have a thing, but we'll move on to another question otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'm always really hesitant when I hear this term, the failure of the left. I mean, it certainly applies definitely if we're talking about, the trade unions and sort of the Greens or the ALP and whatnot. This might be a bit of a micro history, but it kind of makes me wary if anyone knows of the old anti-fascist action document, Filling the Vacuum, that came out of in I think the late 90s, early 2000s, about sort of the BNP shifting to electoral politics. And in response, a bunch of elements from anti-fascist action set up the what they call themselves, the Independent Working Class Association, and I think that they made too much room to people from the right. And then I don't know if anyone's familiar with them now, but they're just echoing far right populist parties. I think there's kind of this danger in shifting the Overton window and making too much sort of space for people on the right. But again, yeah, as Ian says, like the main thing is that we need to be out there concerning ourselves with, the healthcare system. And I think that, it's going to be really interesting and important what issues the left chooses to take up next now that we can hit the streets again. One thing that didn't come up that people might, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but this new trend of so-called red unions that are being, which is ironic label, but they're being set up by this guy from the National Party, I believe. So in Victoria, there's already one that exists in Queensland. In Victoria, there's a new one. It's like a teachers association. A whole bunch of people who are anti-vax have resigned from the IU and the AEU to join these fake unions. And I think they've got fake ones for the ambulances and the police. Well, I don't really care if they join or not, but yeah, that's pretty interesting that, I think that the right are even employing like this fake unionism to try and seize upon the moment.
Okay, thanks. The next question I'll take from Gemma Hooper. Gemma, would you be interested in reading out loud? Otherwise, I will. All right, perhaps I'll read it out then. Gemma says, I'm on the anarchist side of things, so I'm not a huge fan of heavy-handed controls. However, a public response to a pandemic is the sort of thing the left needs to have an answer for if we're not okay with state-based solutions. How would the panelists be alarmed? How would the panelists alarm at the heavy-handedness of state responses go about ensuring that people's desire to enjoy privileges in our society are balanced effectively with the need to protect those who are immunocompromised or at higher risk of death if infected? Anyone like to take that question?
I don't mind having to go. I mean, I'm not an expert in people who are immunocompromised. It seems to me that the exact same medical necessity that they need under normal capitalism would need to be reinforced under a COVID thing. I mean, the idea that lockdown has got anything to do with actually providing those those protections, whatever they may be, ensuring that they've got the medical requirements that they actually need to socially distance and survive, in terms of taking extra leave, not being financially disadvantaged because of they can't work in certain circumstances, etc. All the things that need to be fought for and need to be insisted upon are simply become more important in a COVID situation. They're not exceptional in that regard, in the same kind of way as the kind of things that we're talking about. Casualization is a horror of capitalism. It becomes a life-threatening consequence in aged care with COVID. It's magnified. The point making before about the way COVID actually has magnified those existing flaws in capitalism, and should be, a wake up in terms of that thing. In terms of the public response, I think we need to see it much more in terms of actually what is needed to actually defend, someone's health, protect, someone's health, the capacity to socially distance, to have a properly equipped public health system, to know that we've got enough staff enough nurses to staff in the in aged care and in the the hospitals, etc., all those things which I think are particularly are important, but I don't think it's about locking people away. So I think it becomes I think the collective element, which I see as important, which I do think we had to struggle for and we're still struggling for it actually, is a collective struggle against the authorities, against the state governments, against the employer, against the federal governments, actually to get those things that public health actually needs, to end to have the vaccination leave, to have the sick leave, to have the get rid of the privatized aged care, to have the staff ratios, etc., to for people to be able to have an NDIS which actually works, people have a living allowance and not etc. That's anyway. Yeah, that's where I think that you can see the beginnings of what a public health response could actually look like. I mean, why didn't we have groups of people in Western Sydney, that groups of people who could have gone, door to door to explain things in language, people who they knew, etc., like now we've got people who are going door to door in Cherbourg, one of the historic Aboriginal missions in Queensland, because the things are historically low, but what do you expect when you've starved Aboriginal medical services, when you got curfews that won't allow people to go out after night? Why is it October 2021 that people are going, door to door in Cherbourg? And I'd be interested to know. I mean, hopefully it is the Aboriginal legal service and the health service and stuff who's doing it, and not some bunch of white bureaucrats from Brisbane.
Okay, the next question is from Daniel Pritchard. Daniel, if you want to read it out loud, I'll allow you to talk.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, look, for both Ian and Tommy, both of you sort of come from fairly specific sort of political tendencies. It's sort of in one way or another sort of traditional on the left. With Ian, it's sort of IS Trotskyism, and with Tommy, it's sort of ultra leftism and platformism. I was just wondering if I could speak a bit more about how those sorts of traditions inform the current analyses of the COVID crisis.
Whoa.
Ian, you want to start?
How many more hours we got? I mean, I think that, well, from my perspective, I think it is the socialism from below elements which are a crucial part of the general international socialist tendency, and that the Trotskyism that historically we come from. That says it is ordinary people and the collective power of ordinary people in terms of that struggle against the employer, against the state, which informs the response to COVID. I mean, obviously there's lots of historical things to actually draw on in that in that process. But I think that's fundamentally where it comes from. It's it's an absolute rank and file perspective, which says it is ordinary people that have that capacity, that given the struggle that people can struggle and do change and struggle, and that's where the possibilities of actually challenging COVID, challenging capitalism more generally comes from. Yeah, I could expand on that a bit if I'm prompted.
That's great. Tommy, do you want to respond as well? And then we'll have another question for Simon after that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that like the international socialists, we kind of cling to the label of socialism from below. I mean, this question before about how do we balance anything is really a matter of how does the working class fight for it, against the state. I think that the other side of it is, it's kind of like an ethical question, I suppose. It's about this vision of what communism is, and this kind of understanding that rights, are a collective thing, that really what's good for one of us is good for all of us. It's a principle.
I think perhaps only quickly add to it, I think is the question which we discussed a lot tonight, is the question of state power. Capitalist state power is never a healthy thing.
Absolutely. So the next question from Jonathan Black. Jonathan, do you want to speak?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. This is for everyone, but it was prompted especially by Simon. How is the far right a threat to organizing for socialism? And do we first need to cleanse the ideological orientation of workers? Is this preoccupation with the far right a symptom of the weakness of a left that is unable to lead now? And I'd argue, and perhaps you could make the argument, that has been unable to lead the working class for a long while.
Yeah, interesting question, Jonathan. I think yes is my short answer to that second part of your question. And I think that, you know, I'm a researcher and I spend a lot of time on the far right, and I'm constantly skeptical of my own research of the far right as kind of, am I focusing, you know, making sure that I'm not overemphasizing the power that we give them, and the particularly in a place like Australia, where as I said before, I don't think it's we have this hugely powerful far right in Australia, although we see elements of far right ideas certainly in both of our major parties at different times, and influencing public policy in lots of different ways. But I also have this concern that I think that you've raised here, that we have a mainstream left that is increasingly obsessed with the far right and obsessed with the idea of this huge influence, that there's a growing power that we, that, you know, they're huge in Australia. And we see, you know, elements, we see stories in which they're, you know, we do see protests and people sort of coming out and talking about how what's happening in the US is now happening here. We saw people talking about, for example, in the Melbourne protests, we saw people talking about how this was our January 6th, you know, which is just a kind of ridiculous comparison. And I think it's, to me, I worry that comes from, I do agree that it comes from a sort of a lack of power in the left, and so it's, the far right is an easy boogeyman to create as a sort of reaction against that, and it's a way to get a whole bunch of attention, and to create a sense that we need to be fighting against this, because we don't have any power of our own in many ways. And I think this is particularly true for a lot of people in the mainstream left, you know, the kind of groups I was talking about before, who see that as an easy target to go against, because it's harder to articulate our own power and articulate our own things that we can do. And I think you had a comment there about cleansing the ideological, I think, sorry, it just disappeared on my screen, cleansing the ideological orientation of workers. That sounds quite, I wouldn't use that language, but I think a return to the question of how do we create a materialist left that is focused on the needs of workers and is focused on solidarity with workers as workers. You know, I think many of us here, we're all workers of some form, and seeing the working class as the base of our power, rather than seeing, as I think much of the left does, seeing the smug politics, you know, having a smug politics that sees the left as the working class as a problem. And to me, what it comes to is actually, it's not about cleansing the ideological orientation of workers. It's about cleansing our own ideological orientation of the mainstream left, to see workers as people that are already there in many cases, that already have that politics, and have that frustration with the state, for example. You know, we know that there's growing frustration with the state. And, you know, we've talked about state power a lot here. There's, you know, this sense of anti-politics is really growing in Australia. We've got research to back that up. Yet we still see the working class as a problem to be, sorry, not we, but elements of the left still see the working class as a problem to be dealt with, rather than people we can work with who are already most of the way there. And so it's working with what we've got, and building from that I think we can do. But huge chunks of the Labor Party, the Greens, unions in particular, and this is particularly problematic when you have a union movement that doesn't trust its own working class, which I think is inherently true of how the union movement operates today. We have to change that. We have to change the leadership of these groups so that we have a movement that trusts and works with the working class, rather than one that sees them as a problem that needs to be dealt with.
Thanks, Simon. Do either of the other panelists want to respond to what Simon said or the question directly?
No, I think Simon did a pretty good job, actually. But I just wanted to agree about the question of purging the ideology. I do think it's a bit of the same kind of thing. It does see the working class as a problem. Our problem's not with the with working class as much as we recognise that they are influenced, like we all are, by sexism, by racism, and you have to struggle to deal with those with those ideas. But collectively, I think we've there's plenty of examples to show that they can be collectively organised and and overcome. And the problem does rely much more. I mean, I'm not just sure. That's another discussion, perhaps, about the question of changing the leadership. I don't think it's sufficient just to change the leadership of the union, official. No, but I think that's part of the issue, that we need to mobilise the rank and file, much more effectively to recognise their own power. But yeah, anyway, that was a good question, good answer.
Tommy, do you have anything to add? Otherwise, I have a question for you directly.
No, I actually just turned my mic off to say exactly the same thing about the leadership of the union, so that's all.
Yeah, there's a quid that I said, and then I thought to myself, no, it's not just about leadership; it's about a lot more. But and I think we're all involved in unions, and as I said, I'm involved in the NTEU here, and it is an ongoing frustration with a working class in the union itself, and we're not a very strong union, to be quite frank, but we have a working class here that is articulating all of the problems we have with our industry time and time again, and a union leadership that just doesn't seem to listen. There's been huge fights in the NTEU about even getting proper representation of casual workers within the union itself, because they're seen as not, casual workers don't bring in enough money. So why would we want to spend time working on casualization, which is ridiculous. It's just it's short term. Focused on people who want to sit at a table with the boss, who want to sit at a table with a leadership that wants to sit at a table with the government, get a Labor government elected, and then sit there and nicely negotiate until we get what we want. It's not just about the leadership; it's about the orientation of what unions are and what they should be doing. And we need to be articulating one that's led by the working class, not led by a bunch of leaders.
Thanks so much. Next up, I'll take Marcus Banks. I'll allow you to talk if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to talk about hesitancy again and ask the panelists to talk about the political hesitancy of organising campaigns, of protest hesitancy, of campaign hesitancy, where we've seen the environment movement basically shut down for 12 months and the labour movement shut down for 12 months. So could people talk about the importance of pushing against the rules where there's only 2 or 5 or 10 or 15 people able to gather together to help build the campaigns?
Thanks, Marcus. So that question's about breaking the law in order to organise the left. How would any of the panelists respond to that? Tommy, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. This is something that I definitely thought about a lot during lockdown, was the sort of contradiction that we faced, that, we had to be really careful about our exposure with other people because we don't want to obviously get anyone sick, but at the same time, without the capacity to mobilize, how do we actually enforce or fight for our ideas? And there's no really easy answer to that one. I think it might have been more possible, during the first outbreak, we had the pretty big Black Lives Matter rallies, and I don't think anyone got sick from that. But then, with Delta, it became a lot more serious. In terms of, mobilizing and breaking the law today, well, I guess the thing with breaking the law is always, how are you doing it? How is the campaign doing it? Is this like a tiny little direct action group doing it that won't make much of a difference in the popular consciousness? Or is this a mass action where you're mobilizing lots of people to genuinely vent frustrations and actually make it, a bit of an impact on the state? One thing that I think that's really disturbing actually is, with the recent big right-wing protests in Melbourne, when we had, the right-wing, the anti-vax, I shouldn't say right-wing, but the anti-vax protesters were jumping on the cop cars and smashing their windows and doing all these sorts of things that, quite frankly, the left isn't even capable of. Like when a few years back, when we had the big anti-fascist clashes with, the United Patriots Front and whatnot, that was probably the most militant protest the left has had for quite a while, and there was very little direct confrontation with the state and only a small amount of confrontation with the fascists. I don't know. I think that it's something that really needs to be done, but like all political questions, I guess it's a matter of who are you mobilizing, how are you mobilizing, what strategies and tactics is it going to be? Is it going to be detrimental to the left in the long run, or you actually, balance of forces, basically, I think. But it's something that we should be aiming for. And I certainly think that, the unions returning to direct action and breaking the laws, that's as something that we need to be aiming for. And quite frankly, a few of our union leaders could go to jail for some principles that might actually be useful.
You go to jail for a few other things. Look, I think the question of the political hesitancy is actually a crucial one, because I'd go back to the beginning, where the beginning of COVID, I mean, where we heard from Sally McManus and others about the heroes of the front line, the essential workers, et cetera, et cetera. What kept capitalism going through that period? It was the people in the supermarkets, the people in the warehouses, the people who were driving the trucks, the couriers, the transport drivers. A very small strike in the middle of that. No one would have been exposed to COVID, but the system would have been exposed to a bit of class power. And the supermarkets held an enormous power in their hand at that time. The truck drivers, the same. We're seeing a little bit of that as they're coming out of COVID at the moment. If there had been that modicum 12 months ago and a willingness to actually use that power, Sally McManus was good at talking about it. She wasn't any good at mobilizing it. And we've spent 18 months really effectively being told, ultimately now we're going to be told to wait for the election because it's so, it's so close. But the whole thing at the time was, no, well, we can't do that. We're all in this together, and we can maybe do a little things. At best, we saw a little bit things. I don't want to take anything away from that. It took quite sharp struggles in places that weren't known for that capacity to actually force PPE employers to provide PPE, to provide proper rosters or entrance and exit separation, some basic kind of occupational health and safety things for for COVID to be done, and that took a little bit of organising to do that. But I think it is one of the issues. It's why kind of Solidarity pushed so hard during COVID to organise every little bit of resistance. The international students, the people who are organising against evictions, to try to build the car cavalcades. The refugee movement in both Sydney and Melbourne quite explicitly went out to push and paid a price for it in terms of police repression and fines and so forth for actually challenging the boundaries of what they inflicted on us. And I think in that respect, it's important to recognise that nothing was to be gained in that the price was too high to pay in that sense, in terms of police powers and the right to to protest, for example. That we should have accepted public health orders actually mean you can't say anything, you can't organise, you can't fight back against the state because of public health order. That's not a public health order that's worth the paper it's written on. No one was infected by Black Lives Matter, actually, and they've got nothing to point at in terms of what happened at the CFMEU. They've got a handful of individuals. They probably had COVID, before it, in any way. There's no real, all the things that Simon said before. You can organise outside protests and things, far more effectively and safely than you can inside. But I think we also need to think it's not just a question of public protest in that respect. It's also that strike power. Objectively, that power has increased. Subjectively, what's missing is a political understanding that's the case and a will to organise.
Thanks. Simon, do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I'll just briefly, because I think Ian has stolen a little bit of my thunder about what I was going to say too, which is great. And in that, I think we can focus on protests, and the curtailing of the right to protest during the coronavirus pandemic has been awful, and the police increase in police powers is something the left must oppose at every instance. There's just no way we can look at what is happening in Melbourne, for example, and think that is a good thing, although that won't be used in the next refugee rights protest or the next climate protest or whatever it is, that those powers won't be used. But I'm of the view that sometimes elements of the organised left, I think the environment movement is really true of this. It focuses too heavily on protest, when I think that strike is the most powerful form of protest that we have. And in Australia, we have some of the most restrictive strike laws of anywhere in the world, and it's probably one of the worst pieces of legislation we have in this country in many ways, because it strongly curtails our ability to effectively organise, and stopping the means of production is the most powerful tool workers have. and we don't use it very often in Australia. And we do see now, we're seeing, I think Ian mentioned before, a kind of wave of strikes that are happening in the United States, and that are extraordinarily effective. We saw that a number of years ago as well, where teachers in the US were striking in many of these states that had woeful funding for schools and education, in many of these conservative states, and that they were hugely effective. We have to be thinking really strongly about how can we turn that around in Australia? What can we do to make, to organise for strikes, to properly strike, and also to change those laws? And that will mean breaking the law at some point. And it will mean, I think someone said, some union leaders being willing to go to jail. But it also means it's harder to find individuals when everybody is doing it. You know, that means we have to do some more mass organising to make that potential. One final thought I've always had on that is I think that what has been interesting in the climate movement has been the school strikes, which have unfortunately kind of stopped and come to a halt during COVID, but I hope that changes, because it brings the word strike back into our vocabulary a little bit. But what has been frustrating is that we haven't seen workers who have been able to follow that, or unions that have been willing to do that. In our case, we've had instances in which the NTEU in my university has written to the management to ask them if we're allowed to strike on those days, which is, you know, a complete, it feels ridiculous to be doing that, you know, that the union should be asking workers, the boss, are we allowed to strike? But I cannot think, you know, if we wanted to change climate politics in Australia, the best way to do that would be to have mass strikes of workers. It's not feasible, I think, at the moment. It's just not going to happen, but we need to be thinking about the way to make that happen. And that is something that we could be doing, and that would turn things around quickly, very quickly, but it might require some people going to jail between now and then.
So just a quick little thing, because I think one of the ironies of the protests outside the CFMEU, I don't know whether people picked it up, but one of the things that John Setka complained about the protest outside the CFMEU office is that they wanted him to shut down the industry, and he said, well, if we did that, we'd be in all kinds of trouble. Exactly, but I think it said both things in that respect. One about the leadership's hesitancy, one of the most powerful unions in Australia, and the message it sent to a lot of the rank and file building workers who are outside the place, who are asking Setka to lead the march to the state government.
So on that point, we only have 3 questions left. One from Liam from Platypus. He asks, we've been talking about union leadership. Does the left have such a responsibility to lead, not only in the context of unions? Tommy, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I might start with the context of what it does mean to lead in the union. And I think the most important thing is not who the officials are or who wins the votes at Congress or in factions or whatever. It's who the workers follow on the shop floor. You can be a workplace leader, and you can shape your workplace. You don't even necessarily actually have to have a union to go on strike, to be honest. Hey, I've done it in domestic construction with ununionized workers, and we've effectively gone on Wildcat before. But yeah, I think that if you've got the ideas, you certainly have a responsibility. There's nothing more frustrating than someone that pays service to left-wing and progressive ideas and then doesn't even try and do anything about it. And then, yeah, the same thing goes for social movements or whatever aspect of life, really. The idea of not being a leader, is just an abdication of responsibility. I think it's just a question of what kind of leadership, what methods, what does that mean, essentially? And that's, I guess, informed by our political tendencies. So I think that, what leadership means to an anarchist or one of the international socialists is going to be very different to what it means to someone from the Greens or the ALP, which is going to be much more top-down and bureaucratic.
Any other comments on that? Yep, please.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, I agree with that, Tommy. But I think there's also a bit of a wider question, I think, which is run through the whole discussion, and that is the importance of the left actually providing a leadership. I don't think the leadership that we need is actually going to come from the officials. What we do need is a much more genuine left leadership, which has got an answer, even at the level. I mean, none of us kid ourselves about capacity to do that. And I wasn't familiar with the filling the vacuum anecdote that Tommy, said before. But it's certainly true that politics abhors a vacuum, and it's why there does have to be some capacity in whatever capacity we have in the smaller ways, as individuals that Tommy's gone over on an individual site, at a university, in a suburban area, in a particular whatever way that we can. But the left, does need, I think, to begin a much more, systematic, if that's the word, but to have answers to the questions that society actually throws up, and there's plenty of them at the moment. I think what's characterized it is, I think it's something which Simon said in his introductory comments, at that there's kind of there's not just a fragmentation. In some places there's a collapse of social democracy, and the extent to which those answers have been forthcoming in a situation in which capitalism throws up the crises, the inequality, the poverty, the lack of wages, the discrimination, the oppression and stuff in greater capacity than what we've seen for a generation. Perhaps. So all those questions are still there, and that's, I think, the left does have to be the place where those discussions can be had, answers found, and the attempts to actually lead those elements of resistance, which goes back to the thing I've been harping on about. I think it's why it was particularly important during COVID that there was small ways, it was too small to actually provide some leadership, some demonstration of actually the capacity to resist, even if it's in small ways. It's that which I think holds out the possibilities and the hopes of actually dealing with the not just with, we need the left to grow if we're actually going to deal with the even the small challenge that the right is at the moment. The far bigger challenge at the moment is what in Simon's industry, it's the various university managements, in in Tommy it's the master builders, whatever, they're going to be throwing those things up in, they already are throwing those challenges up in spades, and we've got to have an answer to those things.
Great. I'll just move on to one of the last two questions. David, who I believe is no longer on the call, asks, I think the three speakers allow too much autonomy to the political. Cannot both the collapse of the workers' movement and the rise of the cosmic right, meaning the conspiratorial right, be seen as products of the deep changes to the material composition of capitalism in Australia? Would anyone like to take that?
Right.
I mean, yes, to an extent, but those two things are interlinked: the political and the material relationship. And it's, we can have a whole night about a debate about sort of Marxist theory and what comes first and all of those sorts of things. But I think we have seen obvious material changes in the nature of the composition of capitalism in Australia. We've seen particularly since the Accords of the 1980s, a diminishing power of unions that used to be, have a density well above 50%, quite higher than that. Prior to that, we've seen the continuous decline of that. But we've also seen the rise of neoliberalism and most importantly, I think, wage stagnation that has left many people much worse off than we were 40 years ago. And we see wage stagnation at the same time as we see housing prices, for example, which is happening right now, shooting through. I mean, it's been happening for years and years, but it's happening even more right now in the most paradoxical way, in which we have a declining population, but housing prices shooting through the roof, and people are being left worse off. And so, of course, those things are interlinked to changing political landscape, and that has a major influence. But again, going back to the question before, what role does the left play in that, and how do we sell the narrative, or how do we engage and mobilize around that? Wage growth should be a thing that the left should be fighting for and should be at top of our priority list in many ways, but in many instances, it's not even something that's spoken about in much of the mainstream left at all. And so These things are interlinked, but clearly we have to look at some material changes and how that influences politics as well.
Yeah, yes, I pretty much agree with that. I think, but I suspect behind the question there's also a bit of the question which comes up a lot about, like, is there still a working class? Has not capitalism turned us all into, whatever they call geek workers, or whatever they are, or where we're all competing on platforms to get the little, bits of work. Yeah, sorry.
The gig economy, which apparently
gig, that's right, not gig. That's right. That's right. Yes. But I think when you look at it objectively, I mean, it's quite true, and I certainly am, get horrified from time to time to think that there's actually a generation of workers now in the Australian working class, which has got the experience of enterprise bargaining, which hasn't seen, which has accepted, the strike laws that that have been imposed by successive governments that have been work under the weight of the social democracy and leaders who accepted the the accord. I mean, Simon's union saw very, very recently the union try to push through what was it?
The job protection framework.
Yeah, national framework protection thing, yes, which is exactly the same kind of arguments, and somehow some collaboration between workers and bosses were going to, to be the salvation at the time when they're dealing with 60-70% casualisation. It's true there's been a transformation in many respects. There's a whole lot more of underemployment, of part-time work, of casual work, which is a very obvious part of structural part of Australian capitalism. But I think when you step back, you can also see the fact there are still quite important sections of the working class which are quite well organised, and capitalism's not got to the point where somehow or other the part-time work or casual work has meant the capacity to organise is completely undermined. I mean, and that's why I think there is an interaction between those between those two things, actually, the political and the and the material, consequences. The capacity to organise the people who are casuals, for example, requires a bit of political nous, about how do you draw those people actively into the union. In Simon's industry, they've been some of the most active sections of the of the industry. They're not anti-union. They're people who you want in the union. You want that energy and activity actually to infect the whole of the union movement. Similarly with the building trades, like it's criminal, that the unions in there have been, and under the auspices in that one respect of enterprise bargaining, have kept to places where effectively they can do the deals, between the employers and the unions. They get wage increases relatively easily. They've got high density in the well-organised places, but you don't have to go too far out of town to find the subcontractors, to find the housing sector, etc. That isn't that well organised. I've got a mate in Queensland who sits on a well organised crane, but from where he sits, he can look at about 10 sites around him that are effectively non-union. And I'm like, what the hell are you doing sitting in the crane, Elliot, mate? Like, why? You don't need a union official down on your site. You need them, at the 10 non-unionised places. But enterprise bargaining and the mindset which has gone along with that, has created that kind of weight. And the left, I think, has got a role to play in trying to break that political straitjacket as to be able to do something about the way in which capitalism's transformations are certainly having a consequence.
It's interesting that you raise, Ian, the job protection framework at the NTU, which is, to me, feels like a lifetime ago that was raised. But in many ways it was, because it was something that the union raised. And for those who don't know, the idea was that the union does a deal with bosses where we accept mass wage cuts, up to 10 to 15% of wage cuts, in order to save jobs. And what was interesting about that is that it was the first reaction that the union had to the crisis. That this was proposed in March and April last year. It was the first response they had. They didn't say, let's organise. They didn't say, let's get all our casual workers to just work to rule, just to work the hours that they're paid for, which is not even a strike, just work the hours that you're paid for. And that would bring the system to a grinding halt. And we don't have the capacity to do that. The first thing they thought of was, let's go and talk to the bosses and figure out a way that we can make sacrifices to do that, to save jobs. Now, it didn't work. It collapsed because the bosses weren't interested, because the workers weren't interested, and the workers revolted against it. And what we've seen for example, at the ANU where I work, is that we've seen mass job cuts, 10% job cuts, while the university has been investing money, for example, $800,000 to revamp an office for Julie Bishop in Perth, who's our chancellor. And so it's not that the universities are poor, it's that they spend the money on the wrong things and they don't care about workers. Yet when it came to the crunch time, the union's first thought was not to go and say, stop spending all this money on these things. It was to try and make workers sacrifice even further to save jobs. And it was a disastrous approach that in many ways mobilized a bunch of people to join to oppose it, but has sort of left major problems in the union. But it's a good example of the problems our current union leadership have, and why organising on the ground with workers and as workers is far more important, and having leadership in the way that we talked about before.
And Tommy, I'll just throw it to you as well. The question was, are we giving too much autonomy to the political, or is there deep changes to material composition of capitalism in Australia?
Oh, look, to be honest, I think that Ian and Simon have really covered it. I agree with everything they've said.
Okay, so we'll just then go to the last question, which is from Jason Wong. And you can use this opportunity to sort of add in concluding comments as well, because we won't have other time for concluding comments. Jason says, I've been wondering about the practical meaning of supporting or opposing vaccine mandates in the workplace, in the sense that it has been used by some bosses to sideline discussion on other safety measures, e.g. density limits, ventilation, paid ISO leave, etc. Has that been the panelists' experience? As we approach maximum vax rates, but the pandemic continues to slosh around elsewhere, what does the panel see as the prospects of the next few years of pushing for all these other safety measures and the surrounding political questions about hospital capacity, contact tracing, healthcare availability, and for migrants? And I'll also just tack on a personal addendum of, how do we see the politics of coronavirus playing out in the next 2 to 3 years, and the development of neoliberalism in that period? Tommy, do you want to start perhaps?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's a big question, especially with your bit tacked on at the end there. Okay, so I guess firstly, I mean, the panelists sort of asked a bit of a subjective question about experiences in the workplace, and whether the bosses have used that to sideline things. I mean, in my experience, no. The employer actually got laid off on Friday, but the employer that I was working for was actually really strict about everything to do with coronavirus, and it didn't limit us engaging with other issues. But I know, there's been strikes at a bunch of warehouses over concerns with coronavirus safety. And I can certainly imagine, I can totally see how the bosses would use it to say, you've got your vaccine, you'll be fine, these other things don't matter, or sort of sidelining things and saying, hey, let's not talk about this issue that you have now because we've got bigger fish to fry. I mean, the bosses will use anything they ever can, really, to undermine us. So I think the thing is really just to stick to that basic anti-capitalist principle or basic unionist principle. Like, you just don't drop those things. You just tie it all together like OH&S. It's all part of one big issue. We accept that we need to wear steel cap boots to work. So why wouldn't we accept that we need to have safety measures in place around COVID, including vaccines? But anyway, so as it will play out in the future, well, I mean, that's really one of the big questions, isn't it? I think I mentioned this maybe in my introductory questions, that sort of this vaccine imperialism means that there's going to be other strains that potentially develop in other countries, and then there's no guaranteeing that Australia will be safe from the next variant. That maybe our vaccines won't really work against it. So this really requires a global and integrated approach, and it requires internationalism in the response from workers. Yeah, but at least in our national context, like I certainly think that this proves that one of the things that we need to be out there mobilizing around is the defense of our healthcare system. I mean, I think before the pandemic started, there was the beginning of murmurings about limiting, about rolling back Medicare and slashing funds to that. You know, it was something that we needed to take up anyway. And it's incredibly more important. And just what's going to happen to our hospital systems now? How many nurses and doctors are just going to burn out over this? How long's the backlog on elective surgery? I think it's still only category 1 and category 1A that's allowed in Victoria at the moment. Yeah, so there's going to have to be huge investments into funding our healthcare system, into getting people into education, getting people trained up. We should be fighting for ways to reshape our workplaces that make us safer. There's all sorts of questions that we can be taking a lead on. And yeah, I think that, you know, at least in panels like this, we begin to discuss some of those things. And I'm sure that every left group is sitting around talking about this, maybe not the ALP or the leadership of the NTU or the CFMEU. I think that they're busy thinking, oh, how do we retain our members and make peace with the bosses? But yeah, it's a bigger question for the left to take up. And it's, yeah, I mean, on the other hand, who knows, maybe this will go the way of the Spanish flu and it'll just disappear in 3 years and we're just back to classic class war. But I don't really see that happening.
Ian, would you like to respond as well and conclude?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for all the discussion, comrades, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be part of the discussion. I'm perhaps not the place to take up the question of safety boots, but I don't like the comparison, whether it's kind of seat belts or whatever else. I mean, at least when someone drops a lump of steel, it's on their own foot, and I just don't think it's a comparison which is useful in terms of or perhaps it also does the same thing. It kind of trivializes, I think, the discussion at the moment about the vaccine hesitancy and where it goes. I've got no immediate experience about how the boss actually is dealing with the questions of vaccine hesitancy, but I do see it as at a bigger scale, where it does seem to me that it is being used in so many places as rather than rather just put the other way around, that the politicians are actually saying, the vaccine is going to solve everything. Get vaccinated, get vaccinated, get vaccinated. We're not hearing anything at all, that we did at the beginning of the, of COVID about the public health measures which were, which were necessary. You'll hear a little bit now occasionally about washing your hands and a bit of social distancing, but it doesn't matter too much. But I think then in that respect, there's an element in which the whole vaccine issue is disarmed. There's no reason. We're lucky there was a vaccine this time around in that respect. We may not get a vaccine next time around, and the capacity that we'll have to deal with that will be the public health that we can actually fight for. And I think that's one of the things, that if we're going to have a better public health system, it's not vaccinations which are going to do it. I'm quite worried about whether the Nurses Union in Queensland are going to fight for the 2,000 jobs. 2,000 people out of the workforce in Queensland will put the health system under some stretch unnecessarily. We should be fighting for those jobs. We should be fighting for more jobs, and I think that's the question, where the way in which I think the politics of it has been posed for the union movement. Are you going to accept the sackings in the public service, accept the sackings in the building industry, accept the sackings in the public health system? Sackings in the police we're not so worried about, as already been mentioned, but there are places where it does matter, and vaccination is not the answer to that. It's a question of struggle. It's a question of organisation, as we've kind of been over. And I think that does feed into the more, to the more general question that neoliberalism hasn't gone away. It's going to play out in different ways. I mean, hopefully, we'll see the end of the Morrison government with the next election. The polls are all looking quite good at the moment, but we shouldn't be complacent about that. The Labor Party is not going to solve these problems, for us, or solve the problems that that already exist. The issues are going to be whether we organise, and that's what we're not seeing at the moment. The officials are simply just, oh well, hopefully we'll get the Labor government. Where are the union leaders who are leading the marches, are fighting for your rights at work, that are prepared to challenge the anti-strike laws, that are prepared to shut down the industry, to fight against casualisation, to demand the safe workplaces that we actually need. And those issues, questions of the right to strike and stuff, are going to be as important here. I do worry about what's happening, like internationally. I don't think we're not looking at some, march towards social democracy. But I also think we need to recognise, what's happening in Sudan at the moment. People in Sudan, I didn't take a notice of how many people were wearing masks in the demonstrations. But for them, the question of life itself is going to be posed by the struggle against the dictatorship and against the tyranny there. And the question of the international solidarity is actually going to be quite important. And that's what I'll just perhaps end with, because I do think there are ways in which in Australia those things are posed. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning about the question of the nuclear subs, and posing that that very concretely in terms of the money for health is there. The money for fighting for jobs, to deal with casualisation, to improve healthcare, to get a non-privatized NDIS, and so on and so forth. All those things are there, and they're actually kind of they're interconnected in a way. People have come out with coronavirus. I little concerned without that edge at the beginning. Like I said, the way in which the frontline workers were lionized, where there was kind of an understanding of the intrinsic value of the essential workers and stuff. The last couple of months we've seen that devalued. That needs to be encouraged. And I think one of the things that is going to be crucial over the coming part is the question of of China and the way in which the coronavirus stuff. Morrison's still banging on about it. He still wants an inquiry into the virus. He's still banging the drum about the anti-Chinese racism, which is attached to his whole AUKUS and money for nuclear subs and and so forth. So there's we do need to link those political issues together. They're the things which do are kind of the glue, where they're the mortar there that hold the bricks of working class struggle together.
And Simon.
Okay. Look, I think a lot of what I want to say has probably been covered by Tommy and Ian. I'll make a couple of quick final points before we finish off. I think going to the question itself, I think one of the most interesting and most incredible parts of this, the Australian response, the Australian political response to coronavirus, has been how they, across all political parties, both Labor and Liberal, and federally and state-based, how we have managed to skate through this without the kind of mass investment in public health that you would expect could be a part of this. And there's been a reliance on two major things: a reliance on lockdowns, a reliance on vaccines, and all of these things that we're talking about. It's not just density limits or ventilation or paid leave. These are all things that are relevant, but also investment in a healthcare system to boost the workforce, to boost facilities, to be investing more in making vaccines and having greater capacity in this country to make vaccines. We know we can't make vaccines like Pfizer, for example, which has been an issue here. All of those things are things that governments could have been doing along, right at the start, could have been thinking about doing. There was an incredible moment a couple of months ago where the Western Australian government announced they had a multi-billion budget surplus, at the same time as that there were stories of mass concern that there would be a huge problem with the health system if there was an outbreak in that state. And how they could announce this multi-billion dollar surplus without then saying, well, we have all this money to invest in the healthcare system right now. and they managed to get away without doing that is incredible to me. And it says something about our political system and says something about our response to coronavirus. And so I think that is a space that the left can take up. People want investment in the healthcare system. People will recognize the value. People do recognize the value of it already, and people will recognize the value of it even more. And it's in the healthcare system as a structure, as the hospitals, as doctors, as nurses, but also thinking about OH&S in our workplaces, I think is something that we can and should be demanding a lot more. And in one of the areas where unions can and do have power is in OH&S. Unions, if OH&S reps elected OH&S reps in workplaces have an immense amount of power and can actually shut down workplaces in OH&S issues. It's an area where unions and workers should be focusing more of our attention into the future, not just around coronavirus, but around a whole range of OH&S issues. The final point of where to from now, what's going to happen? What does it look like? I think in my view, in the short term, next year, I think Australian politicians and politics in Australia is going to start to almost forget about coronavirus. We'll have openings. We'll have high vaccine rates. We'll be living with coronavirus. We'll have all of those things will diminish to some extent, and it will start to be seen as an international disease that we don't have to worry about as much anymore, even if there are cases here. Whether that can last, I don't know. And this is just a theoretical proposition that it might happen. I think it's starting to happen already. We're seeing it fall down the news cycle, and I think in some ways that's not a bad thing. But whether that will last, and I think that then the question is that, how do we engage in discussion about the international solidarity around this when will be outbreaks, and there are already mass outbreaks in a lot of countries that don't have the same vaccine uptake, and what can Australia do around that is something that's really important. The other thing I think that we should always talk about, and that we haven't really spoken much about in this panel, is climate change, and it's something that's being spoken about a lot this week with the COP happening. But we know that climate change is likely to lead to an increase in pandemics. We know that it's going to cause greater health issues. We know all of those things because disease spread easier in many of these in sort of a hotter climate. Some diseases do anyway, and so we're going to be thinking about the future of more pandemics with climate change. And I think we have to link these things together and think about coronavirus as something that is linked to climate change. And it's been one of the great shames that the coronavirus pandemic in Australia has dwarfed discussion about climate change up until really recently, particularly following the bushfires in 2019 and 2020, which were almost immediately forgotten in many ways, except for obviously in the communities where they were deeply affected because coronavirus took over the political debate. But we need to be, from the left, returning our attention. I don't think lots of people have always maintained a focus on it, but be thinking about climate change as something that is of utmost priority, and it is linked to things like the coronavirus pandemic. And if we want to stop more of these things in the future, stopping climate change is something that we need to be talking about a lot.
Okay, well, on that note, that concludes our event. I want to thank all the panelists for presenting. I think this was a really interesting and productive discussion. And hopefully we'll continue this discussion through various publications, and we have an open access journal and the Platypus Review. So if people want to write responses to this panel, please get in touch with us and we'll likely publish your responses. I also want to thank the organizing committee for this panel. And lastly, I wanted to mention to everyone that on the 14th of this month, in 12 days' time, we have another panel discussion on the ALP and the left, the historical relationship between the Australian Labor Party and the Marxist left. And later in the summer, we're just planning a panel on the question of what is the party for socialism, relating to the topic of the self-described proto-party Victorian socialists and relations to international phenomena like the DSA. So please follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Platypus Melbourne for updates and announcements on those events. And let's give the panelists one more round of virtual applause.